Hi everyone, this is going to be a lecture that focuses on the material within Chapter 12. This is titled Stress, Health, and Coping. Before I get into any specific detail, I just wanted to start off with an overview of what's going to be covered. So we're going to be discussing health psychology, which is now a new area of study I'm going to be reviewing for you. Health psychology, I will discuss in a bit more detail as we move forward. But as the name would suggest, researchers who operate under this particular area of study are interested in understanding how do social and psychological factors influence overall health outcomes. Health psychology is another branch of study within this broad field that we know of and refer to as psychology. And that's particularly where we notice the emphasis being placed on these health outcomes. An important variable that can influence health outcomes is stress. So stress, the way in which we cope with stress, that's going to be covered under this umbrella of health psychology. As we talk about stress in this lecture, I'll be defining it for you, talking about how stress occurs, how we respond to it, and very importantly, how do we deal with it? So what are some useful coping strategies that can allow us to better manage the stress that we're likely to experience and encounter in everyday life? Another field of study that I'm going to be reviewing briefly at the end of the lecture is positive psychology. So positive psychology, just so that you're aware, is actually a newer field. It's one that developed in the 1990s, and its emphasis is on examining, as you can imagine, some more positive aspects of human nature. So what are the strengths that we're likely to observe across individuals? So we're adding to what we have already gone over throughout the semester. Throughout the semester, I've covered different topics within psychology. We've discussed behavioral psychology. I've talked about developmental psychology, abnormal psychology, and more recently, social psychology. So here we're just adding some other areas that generate research so we can better understand why people do the things that they do. If we turn our attention to health psychology, I just wanted to add a little bit more detail to what I already mentioned. So health psychology specifically is concerned with how do we observe a connection between psychological factors as well as social factors that can influence our overall health, as well as the development of certain ailments and diseases. So because that's the area of concern within health psychology, there's a greater interest in understanding what are some risk factors that can lead to the emergence of certain ailments. Along those lines, there's also interest in understanding the role of psychology in the development of certain medicines, certain interventions or treatments. So health psychology has a wide range of applications. You can see health psychologists really working in a variety of settings. They can work in organizations, in hospitals, in universities, and this is because health is very much a huge part of our everyday life and our ability to function. So we'll be talking about some specific areas that are generating research within this field. Now, some common questions that we're likely to see posed within this area are the following, and a lot of these, if not all of them, relate to our understanding of chronic diseases, which seems to be on the increase in more modern times. So chronic diseases are those diseases that people are going to have to live with throughout their lifetime. Some areas or questions that are related, that are going to generate research, are whether or not patients seek help. Do they ask for help? Do they go to a doctor? If they do, once they receive help, are they likely to follow the doctor's orders and are adhering to the instructions they're given? Or is this not happening? Another related question that connects with something I mentioned previously. When people go to the doctor and when they're given certain instructions, we're expecting to observe certain improvements in health outcomes. But what do we observe in relation to mental health outcomes? Do we notice that certain psychological symptoms seem to emerge? That's going to be something else that is going to generate interest and research. So it's going to be connected to the role of psychology in health. And finally, and this is something we'll kind of be addressing during today's lecture, who is likely to develop certain ailments. We'll be discussing differences across individuals that might lead certain individuals to being a bit more susceptible to development of diseases and ailments. But all of these are going to be questions that are going to generate interest, that are going to generate research. So we're going to be talking about some of the research that has been conducted and some of the questions that have led to a greater understanding of overall health outcomes in this next section. So we're actually going to be focusing on the relationship between stress and health. So as you can imagine, and maybe as you've observed throughout your life, stress can very much influence how we feel, whether mentally, but also physically. And that's what we're going to be discussing in this next section. So let's begin with an overview of stress, what it is. There's different ways in which stress can be defined, and some of the differences in the definition have to do with stress as a stimulus, so stress as almost like a causal variable, but also stress as a response, so as a dependent variable. It's a behavior. I'm going to begin with stress as a response and give you an overview of how that might be described. I have that at the very top. So stress is associated with an increase in general arousal. So stress is, in other words, a physiological response that occurs when we're presented with a possibly dangerous situation. So to that end, it can be adaptive. So what do I mean by adaptive? What I mean is that responding to perceived danger, that's useful, that's functional, because that allows us to protect ourselves. Now, we notice that this arousal or this physiological response has changed over time. So for example, from an evolutionary perspective, we know that our body is designed to respond to stressful situations, and in the past, this would have likely been in the presence of predators or other aggressors. Today, that may not likely be the same situation we're confronted with, at least not regularly. Instead, what we're likely going to have to deal with are situations that occur in society, whether major or minor life events. So an example might be having a difficult workload, whether at school or at work, having to care for maybe elderly parents or families. Those are some of the stressful situations that might lead to this physiological response. So it may not be the same response that our ancestors would have engaged in because we're not really being confronted with the same exact situations. If we talk a bit more about this arousal and how this occurs, this is where we have to go back to some material that we've discussed in previous lectures, and that is a really brief review of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So stress increases activity in the sympathetic division of our ANS. This is where we notice an increase in muscle tension, rapid breathing, increased heart rate. Our bodies are preparing. They're preparing to respond. That's what we notice is happening within the sympathetic division. We have this increase in activity. Now, more specifically, when our bodies encounter any perceived threat, The hypothalamus, which is a region in the brain we've talked about previously, this is going to produce, or at least starts, this fight or flight response, which again is associated with the sympathetic division. And this is then going to signal the release of certain hormones via the adrenal glands. So we see the release of cortisol and adrenaline. So adrenaline is associated with an increased heart rate and elevated blood pressure, and cortisol is associated with an increase in sugar in our bloodstream. So this is just an overview of some of the biological processes that we observe occurring when stress is experienced and the physiological responses that we're likely to observe. Now, when we're confronted with a situation that triggers this response, this will lead us to respond appropriately, whether to respond by fighting, this is referring to that fight or flight response, or leaving, depending on which is the more appropriate response given an assessment of the situation. But when we experience this arousal all the time for various minor events, that's when it can become problematic. And that's what's referred to as chronic stress. An even more extreme version of this would be post-traumatic stress disorder, which is associated with traumatic experiences. We've talked about PTSD when we reviewed abnormal psychology. So you notice that stress can very much impact our mental health. Let's talk about stress as a stimulus. So stress not only is associated with the physiological response, but it's also associated with situations that we encounter in our everyday life. So we can experience major life events that then trigger this physiological response. Examples of major life events would be the death of a loved one, divorce, loss of a job, or even experiencing a major injury. We also might experience or observe stress when we're inconvenienced. This is referring to minor events or daily hassles. So daily hassles might be misplacing your wallets or your keys, maybe being late for an appointment or for a class or for your job, forgetting and realizing later that you didn't submit certain work. Those are daily hassles that as a situation or as a stimulus can trigger this physiological response. So whether major or whether minor, if someone is experiencing stress constantly, this of course can be incredibly problematic. And so that's what we're going to be turning to next. Let's talk about some of the negative effects of stress. Now, stress can impact a variety of areas. It can impact personal outcomes. This has to do with health and mental health outcomes. We'll actually be focusing on this area for the majority of the lecture, but just so that you're aware, we can notice effects on socioeconomic outcomes as well. So different exposure to stress can have different impacts on various groups. And this impact is a form of inequality. So not everyone is going to experience the same levels of stress. And so some people might experience more stress than others. And so this can lead to mental health problems, general poor health outcomes. And to a certain degree, we can see that across socio-political outcomes as well. This is also referring to inequalities that we might observe, particularly with health gaps. So there might be individuals that because they don't have access to adequate health care or health services, they're more likely to deal with problems with general health as well as problems with mental health compared to individuals who have better access to health care services, where maybe those symptoms, those effects aren't going to be experienced to the same degree. Continuing with this topic, negative effects of stress, we're going to focus on some more specific problems that we're likely to observe under this umbrella of personal outcomes. So we're focusing on some negative effects related to mental and physical health. And again, these are tied to chronic stress. So chronic stress has to do with that stress that we experience constantly throughout our everyday and throughout our lifetime. So of course, we're going to notice problems with the following. This, by the way, is just a condensed list. There are so many other problems that we're likely to observe when stress is experienced all the time. And just to further clarify, and tie this back to something I noted previously. When we experience a physiological response because we're confronted with a stressful situation and we deal with it, that's adaptive, that's useful, that's appropriate. But when we're experiencing physiological responses all the time for even minor situations, that's where we can see a problem evolve. And so some problems would be dealing with a weakened immune system, which can make us much more susceptible to catching a cold or dealing with other ailments. Damage to DNA can also be a problem associated with health outcomes because when we notice damage to DNA, that makes it so that we are unlikely to see quick recovery. So when repairing wounds, this might happen much slower. We also see a correlation between stress and heart disease. We'll actually be talking about that a bit more later, but it can also be associated with weight gain, with experiencing heightened levels of anxiety, and stress can also impact our ability to sleep. So not only fall asleep, but also sleep throughout the night and then wake up the next day feeling well rested. So there's a variety of different implications for how stress can influence our ability to get rest when we fall asleep at night. Let's talk a bit now about how we respond to stress. So we've talked a bit about some of the negative effects, and let's see how that's tied into the ways in which we deal with stress or how we respond to it. So an important figure in understanding stress and the various responses to this event is a figure by the name of Hans Selye. He developed what is known as the general adaptation syndrome. And this is a model that proposes a variety of different stages or components, but it basically focuses on a physiological response pattern, and you'll see this as I go through the components below. So the general adaptation syndrome is one, or it's a model that focuses on stress as a defense mechanism, so a means by which we can obtain protection. It also identifies 3 different stages, so alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. I'm just going to briefly talk about alarm and resistance because it overlaps with material I mentioned earlier. So alarm specifically has to do with when we're confronted with a potentially dangerous situation or negative stimulus. This alarm response is the one that initiates the sympathetic nervous division that I talked about previously. So this increased heart rate or temperature, this release of adrenaline and glucose levels. Resistance, this response has to do with the physiological systems, that are produced. So this has to do with this fight or flight response that is generated in response to a stressful situation. Now, ideally, once we deal with this stressful situation, there should be a decrease of this fight or flight response so that we return to homeostasis or internal stability. Now, part of this model has to do with adaptation. So how do we basically cope with these situations that we're exposed to? That's something else that's outlined and that we're going to be talking about in just a little bit. But we do notice that a major consideration of the model is whether or not stress is long lasting. And if it is, and if it's intense enough, it could very much lead to health problems and even death down the line if the stress is so intense and so chronic that it leads to major health problems that are then connected with loss of life. Continuing with an overview of response to stress, now that we've talked about the model proposed by Hans Selye, let's also talk about some of his other propositions. So not everyone responds to stress in the exact same way. He proposed a term known as eustress. This refers to stress that isn't or doesn't have to be necessarily debilitating. This is stress that might actually facilitate or lead to a person's overall well-being and even capacity to perform. So we may or may not have talked about this when I reviewed anxiety, but in a related note, stress and anxiety are not altogether bad things. That's a recurring statement I've made already in this lecture. Stress can lead to better performance, but it depends on how the person views a stressful situation. So for example, a stressful situation might be interpreted as positive and maybe even as a welcomed challenge. So this will inform or determine how the person responds, and they're likely to respond in healthier ways. If instead the person perceives the stressful situation as distress, meaning negative or threatening, then again, this is going to influence how they respond. So we are likely to notice differences in response across a variety of different areas. So one difference is according to personality. So we do notice personality differences influencing how we approach stressful situations. Do we see it as challenging or do we see it as threatening? So let's talk about some of these personality differences. And of course, these are considered individual differences, meaning what I mentioned at the very top, not everyone is going to react in the exact same way. So let's talk about one personality difference. So some research has demonstrated that people who respond negatively or have very strong negative reactions when confronted with stressful situations are more likely to experience negative health outcomes. So we see a correlation between the two. An important note, and this is something that you always want to keep in mind when you hear the word correlation, it's just an association. It does not mean cause and effect. But nonetheless, people who experience or are more likely to demonstrate anger, that's a negative emotion, or respond with hostility, they're more likely to experience or suffer from heart attacks. So specifically, people who score higher along measures of anger are 3 times more likely to suffer from a heart attack at some point in their life. Research also shows that the strongest predictor for physiological stress responses are those that, when confronted with daily hassles, which are these minor inconvenient events, are those that are typically going to respond with some kind of negative emotion, or at least negative emotions dictate how people are going to respond to these daily hassles, and it's likely they're not going to respond very well. So we do see a lot of negative health outcomes associated with these negative emotions. Some other research has also demonstrated an association between different personality characteristics. Maybe you're familiar with type A versus type B, but type A personality, as identified through research, are those individuals that are very competitive. They also don't deal well when they have to wait, so they're very impatient. They can also demonstrate hostility. And related to this impatience that I mentioned a moment ago, everything seems to need to be done right away. They have this increased sense of urgency, which isn't observed across individuals who demonstrate a type B personality. These are individuals that are quite the opposite. They're a bit more go with the flow, a bit calmer, slower to respond to stressful situations. So someone who demonstrates a type A personality are those that are much more likely to get upset and angry. And so because of these negative emotions that they're likely to experience quite regularly, this can lead to damage of the arteries within the heart. Because of this kind of personality style, they're also individuals that are going to lack from social support. Social support is actually really important in how we manage stress. So this can further influence the kind of negative health outcomes we're likely to see correlated with individuals who display a type A personality. So one of the negative health outcomes is a greater risk for heart disease. Just really quickly in terms of type B, so I mentioned those are individuals who kind of demonstrates characteristics that are the opposite of those who experience characteristics associated with a type A personality. But just generally people that have like a positive outlook on life, those that are a bit more optimistic, they generally demonstrate better ways of coping with stress and therefore report less stress. And it also seems to be correlated with better health outcomes, and also better outcomes related to recovery from heart attacks, for example. If we continue with an overview of certain personality differences that we're likely to observe, we also have to examine what is known as the hardiness theoretical model. Just to condense what is proposed through this model, this is another set of like personality characteristics or traits that allow people to stay healthier under stressful situation. And it's because they're often a lot more resilient or hardy. So we'll talk about some of the response patterns observed here. Namely, that's where we take a look at some of the components or elements that are included within this model, and that would be commitment, control, and challenge. So someone who demonstrates resiliency, or as noted a moment ago, demonstrate this hardiness, they're able to show or at least consider the world as interesting and meaningful. That's what's referred to as commitment. So they're more likely to perceive certain events as a welcomed challenge because they might see this as an exciting opportunity for learning. Another important component, one that we'll be exploring a bit more later, is this sense of control. So this is a person's belief that they have ability to control and influence events in their life, in their environment. And finally, challenge has to do with seeing situations that we're confronted with or change and new experiences as exciting opportunities. Exciting opportunities to continue to develop and learn. So we see an overlap with commitment because within this commitment element, people see the world as interesting. Therefore, when confronted with new experiences, so if you think about new experiences, understandably, situations that we're unfamiliar with can be stress-inducing. But individuals who demonstrate this hardiness are going to see it a bit more positively and see it as a means by which they can learn and grow. All of this is to say that people who demonstrate this hardiness, it's not as though they're completely immune to stress. It's simply that they're better at responding to stressful situations and can therefore perform a lot better when these stressful situations arise. So they're better at dealing with new experiences. And they're courageous or considered courageous because they can better handle these events. Next, we're going to be talking about gender differences. So differences that we might notice influence how responses vary across people. So, men typically are more likely to respond to stressful situations by activating the flight or fight response I was reviewing earlier. So, this is, as mentioned, it's a behavioral but also an emotional reaction to stress that basically prepares us to deal with these situations. So, men are more likely to go into attack mode and deal with the stressful situation in a much more aggressive way. If instead they assess the situation and realize that fighting or responding aggressively isn't necessarily the right choice, then they might engage in the opposite, which is a flight response, and instead retreat and move away much faster. Now, this flight or fight response, particularly if it's one that the person is engaging in quite readily and often, it's one that can increase levels of arousal that can lead to negative outcomes. So we're more likely to see men suffer from heart disease as a result of this constant activation of this response. Women don't engage in the flight or fight response as often as men. They're more likely to engage in a different pattern of responding known as a tend and befriend response. So this is a bit more of a healthier approach. It's considered to be a self-protective approach, but it's still a behavioral reaction, and it's one where the individual is going to get involved in certain activities that are going to be useful in creating social networks. And these social networks can then provide support and protection. So I think the best way to think about the tend and befriend response is that women are much more likely to talk to others, about their problems, about whatever is weighing on their minds. And as I alluded to earlier, having social support is hugely important in how we respond to stress, but also how we're able to cope with these stressful situations and manage them. So it is a much healthier response, and it's considered to be a variable that can signal this decreased likelihood that women experience heart disease and other ailments, and might explain why women tend to live longer than men. If we talk about how we manage stress, it's really important to note that ignoring the problem is not considered a helpful approach. It doesn't make the problem go away just because we pretend it doesn't exist. It also is only something, if we ignore the problem, that'll likely work in the short term. So if we ignore whatever is causing us stress, for the moment it might be useful, but in the long term, not effective, because we're likely to re-experience our negative feelings down the line. And these were feelings that we were never able to resolve. So instead, ways in which we can adequately manage with stress are getting social support, talking about our problems. That's a much better approach than ignoring them. There's also a variety of different stress management techniques that are general, and these could be those that range from like cognitive strategies. So maybe meditation, that might be useful for some people. There's also physical strategies, so engaging in activities like yoga, or even deep breathing exercises. Those can be helpful. Other strategies might be environmental in nature, so going for a spa day, engaging in or listening to music, being able to take a walk in nature or in your neighborhood, playing with a pet. Those are all examples of various techniques that we might be able to use. But if we build on that, let's now turn to some specific coping strategies. So there are different ways in which people might cope with whatever stressful situation they face, and this can have an impact on their overall health. There's two coping general strategies that we're going to be discussing, and these are problem-focused and emotion-focused coping. So problem-focused is when we know we are likely to encounter a stressful situation and we do something to actively deal with it. So we're actively addressing the event so that the stressful situation can be resolved. So if we're doing something to deal with the stressor, that's going to be considered a problem-focused coping strategy. So I'm going to give an example from just my own experience, and maybe it's something that as you listen to this, you can relate to. When I was in graduate school, it's an experience that's really overwhelming. It's incredibly stressful just because of the amount of work that you need to complete in such a short amount of time. So I'm referring to each semester. That I realized that in order to deal with the stress I was experiencing, I had to become a lot more organized. I also had to break down the work that I was assigned into units that were manageable. So sometimes, and maybe again, this is something that you guys have experienced, when you think about everything that you have to do, that might produce this physiological stress response. But what I would do to avoid that or to deal with that better was to think about, okay, this is X number of things I have to do Monday through Sunday. Let me organize these activities according to each day of the week. So let me decide what I can reasonably do on Monday and just worry about that. That's the only thing I have to worry about on Monday, getting all of those things done. When I started to compartmentalize and to organize myself and to only think about what had to get done on Monday, what had to get done on Tuesday, that was hugely helpful in dealing with the stress because I was actively working on addressing the workload rather than waiting until the last minute to get everything done, which I knew was going to heighten those levels of stress I was likely to experience. So that might be a strategy that you use in your life as well. If you start to think, or you know that as final weeks are rolling around, you're likely going to have a lot of studying to do, you might think of ways in which you can deal with that time that could be understandably quite stressful. Emotion-focused coping is a little bit different. So here, as the name would suggest, there is an emphasis on regulating emotions that come with stressful situations. So some examples of what might be useful when using an emotion-focused coping strategy might be listening to music, taking a break and listening to music, or watching a funny movie on Netflix, basically just distracting yourself, maybe talking to a friend, going for a walk. Those are ways in which we might be able to regulate our emotion. So if we take a step back from whatever's producing stress, then we might be able to better deal with those feelings that we're experiencing. Now, if you're asking yourself which one is better, it really depends. So emotion-focused coping might be better if we're dealing with situations that are out of our control. So if we're dealing with a situation that is out of our control, we may not be able to create conditions where we address the stress. So in those instances, we might use the strategies or the techniques that I mentioned, maybe remove ourselves from whatever is causing us this negative emotion and take a break, or do something else that we are likely to find enjoyable. Problem-focused coping might be best when we have control over the situation. So when we know something is going to be stressful in our future, then we can take steps to dealing with it. So that may be a useful coping strategy to employ. But it does have an impact on our mental wellness when we do have control of the situation and we can do something to deal with it. So speaking of control, let's talk about how that influences our ability to deal with stress. So we're going to go over some related concepts. Some of these have to do with our ability to control or how we perceive the degree we have control over situations. So we're going to be talking about the internal locus of control, external locus of control, and some related terms, which are self-efficacy and stress-related growth. So control. Let's talk a little bit about that. So control has to do with how we believe, or if we believe, we can influence our environment. If we have that belief, then we're going to consider a greater likelihood that we can exert control. If we don't have that belief, then we're going to kind of feel like life passes us by and we have no way of influencing what happens to us. So that's where we turn to these two varying components: internal locus of control and external locus of control. Internal locus of control is what you might imagine. This means that the person views that they do very much have control over their environment. Situations are within their personal responsibility. So they can make changes that allow them to notice improvements. So if, for example, you are assigned a paper for a class, if you demonstrate an internal locus of control, you are more likely to take ownership over the work that you need to complete. So maybe engage in certain strategies that will allow you to prepare for that activity because your grade is in your control. There's definitely things that you can do to get an A on that paper, but you're looking inward, so you know that this A is something that you can achieve through your own behavior. And so when you get an A on the exam, you can attribute it to the kind of work that you put into preparing, to writing, to reviewing this report that you submitted. If someone instead has an external locus of control, it's the opposite. So they don't feel as though they control their environment. Things are outside of their responsibility or outside of what they can influence. So they will sometimes blame things that are out of their control for negative events that occur. So it was bad weather, it was a bad day, I didn't have any luck, rather than thinking about what within their responsibility or within their control they had the ability to make changes to. So for example, if you don't do so well on an exam, someone with an internal locus of control may have said, well, I didn't really prepare as much. I didn't spend too much time working on the paper. And someone with an external locus of control might say, well, I just had bad luck. Or I had a bad day when I was writing that paper. Now, of course, all of those things can be true, but when that's the person's approach to dealing with most situations, that is then potentially going to be problematic because they're not likely to feel that they can really do anything about things that they encounter in their everyday life. Everything is completely out of their realm of influence. Self-efficacy is the extent to which we believe in our own ability to complete certain tasks, to reach certain goals. So of course, you want to be able to set goals for yourself, and the degree to which you believe in your ability to do so, that refers to this self-efficacy term. Stress-related growth has to do with thriving. So this is how we respond to stress that allows us to see certain situations as an opportunity to grow rather than the stressful situations as threatening. So again, there's many situations in our life that are likely going to be out of our control, that are likely to be challenging. But if we see them as an opportunity to do better, to learn, then we're going to be able to handle the stress that comes along with this unexpected event to a much greater degree. Versus if you see any inconvenience as a threat, that's going to hinder your ability to deal with the situation and allow you to perform adequately. So generally, what we notice is that people who demonstrate an internal locus of control more frequently, that's associated with better health outcomes and an ability to better cope and deal with stress compared to people who demonstrate a pretty consistent external locus of control. The same would apply to people who demonstrate high self-efficacy and this stress-related growth. When you see things from a different perspective and welcome challenges, it allows you to deal with these situations in a much healthier way. Another important concept within this review of stress and coping has to do with emotion regulation. So emotion regulation refers to how do we control our emotions. So emotional responses like stress, as I've mentioned already, are useful. So remember, stress allows us to deal with potential danger. It's almost like a warning, and it allows us to respond. But we want to be able to keep these emotions in check, because it can allow for certain behavior to get out of control and then become problematic. So if we're always dealing with stressful situations by responding to these negatively, as also mentioned repeatedly through the lecture, that can be associated with these negative health outcomes. So how do we deal with emotions in a better way? How do we control these? Because these, as noted, are correlated with important positive outcomes. So there's been a lot of research conducted by an investigator named Walter Mischel. So he showed how responding to certain situations, and more specifically regulating emotions, could be linked to later positive outcomes in life. So I'm going to actually be posting a video of a more recent demonstration of the work Mischel conducted. But just to give you an overview before you see the YouTube video later, he would set up conditions where children were given like a snack. The experiments are also referred to as the marshmallow experiments, because in some instances, and you'll see this in the clip, the children, who were all relatively young, were given a marshmallow by an adult. And the adult would tell them, if you wait and you do not eat this marshmallow that I'm giving you, so you demonstrate a degree of delay gratification. So they didn't say that specifically, but that's what was alluded to by asking the children to wait. So if the children demonstrated this ability to delay their gratification, could withhold or limit their ability to eat the first marshmallow right away, they would get a second marshmallow a little later. Now, Mischel found an association between the children who were able to regulate, who were able to delay gratification, with outcomes that were considered positive later on in life. So if they were able to wait for that second marshmallow without eating the first, this was correlated with an ability to demonstrate higher college entrance exam scores. So basically they would do better on like an SAT. It was also correlated with being perceived as much more socially competent by their friends. And it also was linked with a better ability to cope with stress and any situation that was deemed frustrating. So in other words, this ability to self-regulate was associated with a variety of outcomes that are considered to lead to success. Those children that did not regulate their emotions, that did not delay gratification, that ate that first marshmallow right away, the same associations were not observed. Now, an important note, these are correlations. Keep in mind, there's so many things that can influence whether or not a child decides to eat a marshmallow, a cookie, a snack immediately, and those aren't being considered within this particular study. So just want to emphasize that we're talking about correlations. On its own, eating a marshmallow or other snack isn't going to be considered a causal variable for these positive outcomes later in life, but it might be helpful in predicting whether or not we may see these down the line.